The year is 1944. Europe is burning. Entire cities lie in ruins, their skylines blackened by fire and smoke. Villages that once rang with laughter now echo only with the rumble of artillery and the distant cries of war. German armored divisions, powerful, precise, relentless, had dominated the continent for years. Their steel beasts, the Panthers and Tigers, seemed unstoppable, grinding their way across fields, forests and towns, leaving devastation in their wake. But then, on the western horizon, a new sound began to rise. It was the sound of engines, deep, unyielding, unrelenting, the sound of American steel. It was the moment when the United States unleashed its arsenal of tanks upon Europe. The Shermans, the Pershings, and their iron brethren became more than machines. They became the pulse of liberation. These weren't just tanks rolling across mud and rubble. They were symbols of hope. Symbols that carried with them the might of a nation that had crossed oceans to confront tyranny. With every mile they advanced, they shattered the myth of German invincibility. They turned fear into courage, despair into defiance, and battles into turning points. And as the earth shook beneath their tracks, soldiers and civilians alike knew the tide was turning. The war that once seemed endless now had a new chapter written in steel, fire, and freedom. When American tanks first rolled into battle on European soil, the world seemed to hold its breath. The year was 1944, and the continent had already endured 5 long years of devastation under the iron grip of Nazi Germany. The Wehrmacht had earned a fearsome reputation, and its armored divisions, led by the formidable Panzer, Panthers and Tigers, were the beating heart of its war machine. German propaganda painted these tanks as invincible predators, prowling the battlefields of Europe with unmatched power. Allied soldiers, who had witnessed their might in earlier clashes in North Africa and Italy, knew all too well the destruction they could unleash. Against such giants, the arrival of the American Sherman tank seemed almost underwhelming. Soldiers joked about the Sherman being a Ronson after a lighter brand, claiming it lights up the first time every time when hit. These jokes masked real fear, the idea that men would be climbing into machines that, when struck by the German big cats, offered little chance of survival. But what few understood at first was that the Sherman was never designed to fight alone. It was not built to duel one-on-one against a Tiger tank in an open field. Instead, it was part of something greater. A strategy of overwhelming force, industrial might, and relentless mobility. The United States had mastered the art of production, and what it could not match in sheer individual quality, it would crush with numbers, coordination, and unyielding persistence. For every tiger prowling the forests of Europe, there would be dozens of Shermans ready to engage, advance, and keep the line moving. When those first columns of Shermans rolled down the dusty roads of Normandy after D-Day, their engines thundered like an approaching storm. Villagers peeked through shattered windows and ruined barns to see the armored beasts making their way forward, accompanied by the rhythmic pounding of boots as infantry moved in step alongside them. The tanks were not sleek or imposing like their German counterparts. They were boxy, practical, utilitarian. But they carried with them the confidence of a nation that had crossed an ocean to fight. For the soldiers riding inside them, the Sherman was both a lifeline and a gamble. They knew it could be pierced by German 88mm shells with terrifying ease, but they also knew that without it, advancing against fortified positions would be impossible. The first clashes were brutal. In hedgerow country, where every field was bordered by thick walls of earth and foliage, the Shermans moved cautiously, their commanders peering through narrow slits, scanning for the telltale muzzle flash of a hidden panther. When a Sherman was hit, the sound was deafening, the blast tearing through steel, flames bursting from hatches, crew members scrambling to escape. For those who watched, the sight could shake a man's spirit. And yet the Shermans kept coming. One destroyed tank was replaced by 2 more. A burned-out wreck on the side of a road was followed by another armored column pushing forward. The Germans could kill tanks, but they could not stop the tide. This was the secret strength of the American war machine. In Detroit, in Chicago, in factories across the Midwest, assembly lines never slept. Day and night, workers, men, women, immigrants, farmers turned machinists, built tanks with a speed and efficiency that no other nation could match. By the time a German factory had finished assembling one Tiger, American factories had produced multiple Shermans, shipped them overseas, and prepared them for battle. This relentless cycle meant that while the Germans produced highly advanced, carefully engineered machines, they were outnumbered at every turn. But numbers alone did not tell the whole story. The Sherman had other qualities that proved decisive. It was fast. It could maneuver across muddy fields, climb hills, and cross rivers with surprising agility. It was mechanically reliable, far less prone to breaking down than the complicated German designs. For a soldier who needed to keep moving, a tank that started up every morning, that didn't stall in the middle of combat, was more valuable than one with thicker armor. Crews grew to respect their Shermans, not because they were indestructible, but because they could be trusted to carry them forward when the order came. For the German tank crews, the relentless sight of Shermans advancing was unnerving. They could destroy 1, 2, even 3, but the Americans never stopped. Every time the smoke cleared, another column was forming, another wave advancing. This constant pressure stretched German lines thin, exhausting their ability to respond. For every Tiger dug in along a ridge, there were countless Shermans circling, flanking, probing for weaknesses. The American strategy was not to meet German tanks on equal terms, but to overwhelm them, forcing them into positions they could not hold. In one clash, outside a small French village, a German Panther crew watched as a line of Shermans advanced across open ground. They fired once, one Sherman burst into flames. They fired again, another destroyed. But as the smoke rose, the Americans did not turn back. More tanks emerged from the tree line, more infantry advanced behind them, and soon artillery shells rained down on the Panthers' position. The crew was forced to abandon their tank and retreat. For them, the lesson was clear. They could win individual battles, but against this unending tide, they could not win the war. For the American crews inside the Shermans, the experience was harrowing. They lived every day knowing their armor was thin, that a single hit could end them. Yet they climbed inside willingly, because they knew their role was larger than themselves. They knew that every mile gained brought their comrades closer to home, brought Europe closer to freedom, and brought the war closer to its end. Their bravery lay not in the invincibility of their machines, but in their willingness to keep going despite the risks. And so, as summer turned to autumn in 1944, the rhythm of the war changed. No longer did German tanks dominate the battlefield with fear and superiority. Now the battlefield trembled with the sound of American engines, endless columns of Shermans rolling eastward, carving through fields and towns. The tide was not turned in a single moment, but in the steady grinding, unrelenting advance of men and machines that refused to stop. The German big cat still roared, but the forest was filling with hunters who would not be deterred. For the first time in years, Europe could feel the tide shifting, the balance tipping, the end approaching, not because of one perfect machine, but because of many, moving as one. As American armor pressed deeper into Europe, their presence reshaped the very face of the battlefield. For the weary infantry who had clawed their way forward against fortified positions and deadly ambushes, the arrival of tanks was more than a tactical shift. It was salvation. Before the Shermans appeared, men were forced to crawl on their bellies through mud, dodging machine gun nests and artillery that rained down mercilessly. Every advance felt like an act of desperation, where courage was measured in inches of blood-soaked ground. But when the rumble of treads grew louder, when the steel giants rolled into view, soldiers felt a wave of reassurance. The tanks turned what had seemed suicidal into something achievable. The partnership between infantry and armor became a bond forged in necessity. Soldiers learned to move with the tanks, to shield themselves in the wake of their armored bulk. A tank could smash through a hedgerow or a stone wall that had pinned down dozens of men, opening a path where none had seemed possible. Infantry, in turn, protected the tanks from ambush, flushing out enemy troops armed with panzerfausts hiding in the shadows. Together, man and machine created a rhythm of advance, steel leading, flesh following, each relying on the other. For the civilians trapped in occupied towns and villages, the arrival of American tanks was a spectacle of liberation. Imagine the scene. Narrow streets choked with rubble, houses riddled with bullet holes, church steeples shattered by artillery fire. The townsfolk had lived for years under the boot of occupation, their every day dictated by fear, ration cards, and silence. And then, one morning, the ground began to tremble. Children pressed their ears to the walls as a deep growl echoed down the streets. Slowly, the first Sherman appeared around a corner, its barrel swinging like the gaze of a watchful guardian. Behind it came another, then another, their turrets turning in unison as soldiers waved from the hatches. For many civilians, the sight was almost unbelievable. They had grown used to the grey of German uniforms, the bark of German orders. Now men in olive drab leaned from the steel hulls, grinning, tossing chocolate bars or chewing gum to wide-eyed children. To the exhausted villagers, the American tanks were more than weapons. They were the embodiment of freedom rolling into town. Old men who had survived 2 wars stood silently in tears. Women clasped their hands to their mouths. Children ran barefoot alongside the tracks, daring to laugh again after years of silence. These moments became etched into memory, as profound as any battlefield victory. The tanks themselves became symbols, carrying with them an aura of invincibility that extended beyond their actual armor. A village that saw Shermans in its streets knew that the days of Nazi rule were over. Flags hidden for years in attics and cellars, French tricolors, Belgian banners, Dutch orange, suddenly appeared in windows, draped across balconies, waved from rooftops. To the civilians, the tanks were not just machines. They were heralds, announcing that liberation was here, that the world had not forgotten them. For the soldiers riding on the backs of those tanks, the experience was surreal. Perched atop steel, rifles slung over their shoulders, they could see a landscape of destruction stretch for miles. Smoke rose from distant villages, fields lay churned into mud, and every bend in the road threatened an ambush. Yet there was also the sight of smiling faces, women offering bread, children handing flowers, men reaching out to shake hands. It was a strange contrast, the constant threat of death alongside the overwhelming gratitude of those they had come to free. For many American soldiers, those moments of joy carried them through the horrors of war. But the battlefield did not grant easy victories. The tanks were celebrated, but they were also hunted. German anti-tank guns, hidden along hedgerows or dug into barnyards, waited patiently for the chance to strike. Every advance into a town carried risk. One moment the streets filled with cheering civilians. The next moment an ambush could tear through the column. Tank crews knew that liberation and destruction walked side by side. They learned to fight with caution, to scan every window, every rooftop, every church tower for the glint of a scope or the barrel of a weapon. The psychological impact of tanks on both sides cannot be overstated. To American infantry, their arrival meant life, meant progress, meant a shield against impossible odds. To civilians, they were rolling monuments of hope, proving that oppression could be overturned. And to the Germans, they were a nightmare, a relentless force that multiplied no matter how many they destroyed. Every time a Tiger tank claimed a Sherman, it mattered little, for another wave followed. That knowledge gnawed at German morale, sowing doubt, weakening the once unbreakable image of their armored might. As the Allied push deepened, villages that had been grey with despair found themselves painted with colour again. In the shadow of tanks, small acts of life returned. Markets reopened. Bells rang from half-destroyed churches. Songs were sung in taverns where silence had reigned for years. These were fragile, fleeting moments, but they mattered. They reminded everyone, soldier and civilian alike, of why the fight continued. And still, the Shermans rolled forward. Through the mud of autumn, through the chill of winter, they carried their crews and their passengers into the heart of Europe. They were not perfect machines, but they were enough. Enough to keep hope alive, enough to sustain the advance, enough to bind soldiers and civilians together in a common cause. The belief that tyranny could be broken. The bond between man and machine, between liberator and liberated, gave this chapter of war its soul. And as the tanks moved eastward, leaving behind trails of dust, smoke and hope, they carried with them not just soldiers, but the spirit of freedom itself. By the final chapters of the war, American tanks were no longer newcomers on the battlefield. They had become the steady drumbeat of the Allied advance. What had begun as cautious, uncertain engagements in the hedgerows of Normandy had evolved into a relentless march across Europe. The tide of battle, once leaning heavily in favor of Germany, now surged with unstoppable momentum. Wherever the Shermans and their armored kin appeared, the ground seemed to shift beneath the enemy's feet. The once invincible Wehrmacht found itself pressed back, not only by artillery and infantry, but by the unyielding pressure of American steel carving across the continent. Nowhere was this transformation more evident than in the fields of Normandy, where the Allies had clawed a foothold after D-Day. The German High Command believed they could contain the invasion, using their powerful tanks to crush the beachhead before it spread. But the Americans, bolstered by their Shermans, refused to be contained. Day after day, week after week, they pushed inland, tank tracks grinding over hedgerows, smashing through villages, rolling past the wrecks of both friend and foe. Each advance was hard won, paid for in blood and fire, yet each step carried them closer to breaking the German grip on Western Europe. From Normandy, the advance spread like wildfire. The summer of 1944 saw American armored columns pouring across France, moving faster than even their commanders expected. The Germans, stretched thin, tried desperately to regroup, but they could not match the speed and consistency of American armor. The Shermans, despite their vulnerabilities, moved with a rhythm that kept the enemy perpetually off balance. For every German counterattack, 2 new American pushes followed. Bridges were crossed, rivers forded, towns liberated. Each time the tanks appeared in the streets, civilians knew the nightmare was ending, and yet the war was far from won. In December 1944, the German army launched a desperate gamble, the Ardennes offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. In the frozen forests of Belgium, under a canopy of snow and smoke, German armor surged forward, threatening to split the Allied lines in two. The panzers roared back to life, and for a moment it seemed as though the tide might shift once more. But here in the bitter cold, the true resilience of American armor was revealed. Shermans, dug into icy forests, held their ground against wave after wave. Their crews endured frostbite, exhaustion, and constant shelling, but they refused to yield. Reinforcements arrived in endless streams, tanks grinding through snow and ice to plug the gaps, to push back against the German thrust. Slowly, painfully, the tide of the Ardennes turned, not through the brilliance of one decisive weapon, but through the sheer endurance of many, fighting side by side. By early 1945, the tide had become a flood. American tanks rolled across the Rhine, crossing into the very heart of Germany. Each mile gained brought them closer to the fall of the Third Reich. Cities that had once seemed untouchable, Cologne, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, now faced the thunder of American treads in their streets. German defenses crumbled under the weight of constant armored assault. For every Tiger that stood defiant, a dozen Shermans pressed forward, flanking, circling, overwhelming. The strategy of attrition, backed by America's unmatched industrial might, had broken the spine of German armor. But the story was more than strategy, more than steel. It was about the men inside those tanks, men who had grown from fearful rookies in Normandy to hardened veterans by the time they crossed into Germany. They had lived through fire, through terror, through nights spent in frozen forests with engines idling to keep the cold at bay. They had lost friends, buried comrades, and carried on because they knew that stopping was not an option. For them, every mile of tank track across Europe was a mile closer to ending the suffering, closer to home, closer to peace. The impact of American tanks went beyond battlefields. They shaped morale, reshaped strategy, and carved the very image of liberation. In every liberated town, civilians painted murals of tanks, told stories of their arrival, and remembered them as the moment freedom returned. For German civilians too, the sight of endless American columns rolling across the horizon signaled something undeniable. The war was lost. The once mighty Reich could not withstand the weight of this advance. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the story of American tanks was etched into the very soil of Europe. From the beaches of Normandy to the banks of the Elbe, their tracks marked the path of liberation. They had fought not as lone gladiators, but as parts of a larger symphony, one of strategy, numbers, endurance, and courage. They proved that wars are not always won by the most powerful weapon, but by the relentless force of will, determination, and unity. The tide had turned, and history itself had shifted course. American tanks, rolling steel beasts born from the assembly lines of a distant continent, had crossed oceans, toppled myths, and reshaped the fate of nations. They were more than machines. They were the iron fists of freedom,